The Chris Johnston Show.
Let's go!
Your number one destination for a behind-the-scenes look at the game of hockey.
Is this thing on?
Here's NHL insider Chris Johnston and host Julian McKenzie.
We were supposed to record our show at 5 o'clock Eastern. We started a couple minutes late because of a tweet CJ sent out. Pius Suter is off the NHL's free agent market. Announcement incoming. As of now, we do not know where Pius Suter will be playing. We are still waiting for that news. CJ, you are literally holding us up for Pius Suter news. If you want any indication on how the free agent market is going right now, this is where we're at.
Yeah, this sums it up, right? We're at day 2 here of free agency, and I can tell you that Pius Suter is heading to the St. Louis Blues on a 2-year deal.
All right.
$4 million per year. So that's live and fresh for us here at the CJ Show. But yeah, I mean, it wasn't the extravaganza of years gone by. In fact, when we look at this trade deadline, most of the biggest activity involved players staying where they were, right? But in Pius Suter's case, just before we put that one to bed, he had a great season in Vancouver. The Canucks had interest in keeping him. I think the money was going to be tough to make work for them in the sense that they might have had to move other pieces around in order to make it work. Ultimately, he's off to St. Louis for his opportunity. And one more name comes off the big board. It's a pretty empty big board at this point.
All right, Siege, let's move on from Pius Suter to Mitch Marner. That saga is finally over. Through sign and trade, he is now a member of the Vegas Golden Knights. What did you think of the press conference in Vegas he had where he gets to meet the media and fans? What did you think of how relaxed he looked? I noticed a lot of fans were pointing that out, and so many other insights we can get into. We're going to spend a lot of time on this story, but what did you think of that opening presser?
Well, look, it was, from what I'm hearing, he made a very strong first impression down there on everyone with the Golden Knights. I mean, it's the press conference, but it's also, he and his family meeting an organization where he's just signed an 8-year contract, right? I mean, this is the rest of his hockey playing life for all intents and purposes. I mean, perhaps he gets a contract beyond that one, but the decision, at least at this point in time, this is his new home. And, it was, he looked to me like someone who naturally, I think, has left the weight of the world behind him. I'm not even referencing the fans, the playoffs, I'm not talking about that stuff. I mean, I just think this process weighed on Mitch Marner. And I do, we talked earlier that him and his camp, maybe at one point were thinking of approaching free agency with the short-term deal. I think ultimately the stress of all this and the fact that he could get to Vegas and that the Golden Knights were willing to do the sign and trade, willing to give him an 8-year contract, in the end, that was just too compelling to pass up. And as much as we can sit here and say you could have made more money, do 3-year deals and then do it again and do it again and do it again, there's a lot of turbulence that comes with that, right? On a human scale. And, I just think that for Mitch Marner, this is, I think that this is the start of the next chapter of his life. That's how he's been viewing it for some time, right? His wife, Stephanie, was pregnant through the year. We saw him with baby Miles there in a yellow Golden Knights 93 Marner jersey. And at the opening press conference, and this is the start of the next chapter of his life. So, I get the fans are going to feel any kind of way, and you've earned that right as a fan. And you know what? 2 things at once can be true, Julian. The Marner, Matthews, Nylander era did not yield the results specifically in the playoffs that those players thought they would, that the organization thought they would, the fan base thought they would. Even media members like myself probably thought they would when we were covering that team back in 2016, 2017. But at the same time, also, I think Mitch Marner has 100% earned the right to become a free agent, to choose where he wants to play his career. I mean, the one thing I always reminded of, careers are short in the NHL. You don't get a long time to do this, even when you're among the best, even if you have a long career. I mean, Mitch Marner's already played 9 seasons in the league. He's just signed an 8-year deal. I mean, that might be the entirety of what he's got. I mean, hopefully for his sake, it can go right into his 40s. He can sign a Brad Marchand contract and be under contract till he's 43 one day. But I mean, the reality is it is a short time to do what you want to do. And, what I saw in his body language, his demeanor, just knowing him a little bit and talking to people around the situation is, he was ready for this. And, I think that, I don't know how much second guessing we want to do. The Leafs as an organization probably should have recognized this a couple of years ago. But I do acknowledge it's easy for me to sit here and say that, having seen how it's played out and not being the one making those decisions. But, we've been telegraphing this for a while. Mitch Marner was always going to go to the open market. He had long since made the decision. He was leaving Toronto, and, he ends up at a place where the Golden Knights, which we can get into, they've wanted him for a long time. They landed their man here, too. That's the other side of the story.
I would love for you to go into that even more. I know we kind of touched on it on the last episode, but what more can you say about the process and how much, and maybe even how long Vegas wanted Mitch Marner on their team?
Well, I think Kelly McCrimmon specifically has obviously had his eye on this player. I mean, it's someone, in fact, he was involved with the Canadian World Junior team when Mitch Marner was playing for the team. So you're going back, basically a decade to that point in time where they would have first met each other. And I'm sure, like a lot of GMs who look at players around the league and you just think, hey, I wonder if one day that player ever becomes available. Like, that would be a good fit for us. I can tell you right now, there are GMs in multiple cities thinking that about Connor McDavid, right? Just to give you an example. This is not exclusively a Mitch Marner thing, but I mean, you start to look at a player who has that kind of caliber, who's still in his prime, who has a potential to be moved or to have a contract that's ending. But I would like to say that, this is a player I think that has been on the radar for the Golden Knights. Obviously, they had discussions with the Maple Leafs, about trades at multiple junctures, which we've discussed. And, one thing Kelly McCrimmon dropped in his media availability on July 1st was that it was actually the Leafs that approached them about a potential deal that would have got Marner to Vegas at the trade deadline in a three-way deal that never materialized. I know that deal was going to potentially with Carolina with Rantanen going to the Leafs. And, as previously reported on the CJ show, the Golden Knights to Carolina part of that package just didn't make sense. And so that trade, I don't think, really got off the ground. But at least this, the sides were exploring it at that point in time. Obviously, Mitch Marner even mentioned the Four Nations break. His wife was talking to some of the other players on Team Canada, who were there from Vegas. Mark Stone was on that team, Shea Theodore, Aiden Hill. So point is this has been a long time coming. I think that I can say that and still not make it, like, it doesn't mean the fix was in. I'm sure, I realize fans of the Leafs are probably going to feel a certain way. Mitch Marner just had his best season in the regular season by points. So I don't think you can say that, it affected his performance. Again, wasn't what maybe he or the team was hoping for in the playoffs, but, I do believe he gave it his all and wanted a fresh start. And now he gets it. I think it's going to be a pretty compelling chapter. The Golden Knights are always aggressive, man. I mean, as part of this, they're losing Alex Pietrangelo, a little more clarity on his health situation. And, Kelly McCrimmon did say he doesn't expect him to play again. So at this point in time, we have to imagine Pietrangelo's career is over. And so, the hunt is on in Vegas for more upgrades. But they just got the biggest fish available at this point in time, unquestionably, an 100-point scorer, a former Selke Trophy nominee, and Mitch Marner.
Before I ask you about what could be next for the Leafs, they still have to find a way to fill a hole that Mitch Marner-sized hole has to be filled. There are a lot of fans who are going to be feeling this fallout for quite some time with Mitch Marner no longer being a Leaf. We've posted so many videos on Instagram about us talking about Mitch Marner, and fans still comment on it to this day, weeks after they've been posted. I'd love to know, from your perspective, I know you're not a fan, you're a journalist, what do you think Mitch Marner's legacy is as a member of the Toronto Maple Leafs? I can understand if this takes some time. It's a big question, but I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
I think legacy sometimes is like a little overstated in sports. I mean, what his legacy is for me is he was part of a group of pretty special players that arrived at a team that really needed it at the time and lifted the organization out of the ashes. They just didn't get all the way up the mountain. You know what I mean? But those players all delivered on their promise. And obviously Austin Matthews was a first overall pick, but William Nylander was taken 8th, if I'm not mistaken, in the draft. Mitch Marner was 4th. Obviously, whenever a team drafts that high, you're hoping to get a good player, but you're not guaranteed to get an organizationally significant player. And that's what the Leafs got in all of Nylander, Marner, and Matthews. So as much as the core four with John Tavares joining in free agency in 2018 has been broken up. I think those players to some degree historically when it comes to the Leafs will obviously be linked together. Part of their reputation is going to be that they didn't get it done in the playoffs. There's all kinds of reasons for that. I mean, Kelly McCrimmon even mentioned that the Leafs were hurt by a flat cap, which came about in large part due to a pandemic no one could control, right as they had just extended those players to, pricey deals. So, I mean, there's a lot of factors that go into something like that. But I think that Marner will be remembered as someone who was very exciting. Played certainly in the early days, like with a kind of, I think, an enthusiasm and a joy that, again, hadn't been seen from Toronto for a long time. It's a pretty long run from 2004 through to 2017, 2016. I mean, there was a lot of years there. The Leafs were nowhere near a playoff spot. A couple of times where they were and fell out. The one time, of course, they made it the lockout shortened year in 12-13. They had that 4-1 lead in Game 7 against Boston evaporate. So, I mean, it was just, that was a really difficult period for a significant organization in the league. And Marner was a big part of lifting the Leafs out of that. So, anyway, it's I guess like all these things, it's a bit complex. I think it's going to be emotional though. Like he will be booed by some meaningful portion of the fans when he plays his first game back as a visitor at Scotiabank Arena. I don't have any doubt about that. But, I do think over time, these things tend to fade and it's sports and, he didn't do anything wrong from the perspective of he just, he had the right to basically play the season out the way he did. And I'll point you back to the fact that the trade deadline, his wife was 7 or 8 months pregnant. I mean, say what you will, that's not the ideal time for anyone to have upheaval in their life and their job, certainly anything they can control. He could control that with a no movement clause. So, I understand why he didn't want to go play for 2 or 3 months in another city where he wasn't going to be living when it was such an important time and with what was going on at home. And so, I do think once everyone gets through the emotion of this and the dust settles and everyone gets used to the new reality, I don't know that, I don't know what to what degree that Mitch can come back, if you want to say, in Toronto. Like, I don't know. I'm sure for some fans, there's probably still people out there that, they ball their fist, they ball their hand into a fist when they hear Vince Carter and bang a table if you're a Raptors fan of a certain age or, this happens. But, at the end of the day, this isn't him as a villain. This is a guy who exercised his rights, chose to leave his hometown. I mean, I would say you're surprised it ever got to this point if you didn't live it. But I lived it in terms of being pretty close to it in my job. And I can understand how everybody got to this stage where this was probably best for everyone.
I feel like you're more optimistic about that than I am. And I understand I have the outside perspective on this, but you mentioned Vince Carter. Yes, there are fans who were upset for years about how Vince Carter left Toronto and how he looked back at some of the games he played as a Raptor and he was like, you know what, I probably could have went a little harder. But I think at the end of the day, as those memories fade, you look back and you get a player who not only was all world and dynamic, he helped put Toronto on the map when it came to basketball. You look at the 2000 slam dunk contest, we look at that as like one of the greatest single dunk performances of all time in that contest. And Vince Carter is that guy. And everyone all of a sudden was starting to look at those Toronto Raptors a little differently. He helped change that perspective and help add the fact that basketball is a huge part of that city. When I think of Mitch Marner and everything that he's done for the Toronto Maple Leafs, there are some good things you can point out in terms of the statistics and what he's done on the ice. But I just think he was just too associated with so many moments of failure for this organization. Yes, there was the upswing at the beginning of his tenure where the Leafs are trying to figure themselves out. It's cool to have all these cool young guys and be fresh, but we don't need to rehearse all the failures for this organization. But Mitch Marner is there at the center of all of that. And I wonder if the fact that there was so much of it, if that ultimately clouds judgment for so long when it comes to fans processing Mitch Marner. That's just my outside take of it.
Well, the one thing I'll just say is time does cure these things, and let's see where things go, right? if the Leafs move on here, and it's too soon, and I know we're going to get into this discussion, but if they move on and they still have a good team and they use the cap space to get wisely and they have maybe more success than they had in the past, I mean, who's going to be holding on to a grudge about Mitch Marner? Similarly, it would not surprise me remotely to see Mitch Marner go and have like a mountain of success somewhere else. And especially on a team like the Golden Knights, which, as we know, go all in every season. They're always in the mix as a team that could win the cup or I realize they fell in the second round this year pretty quickly to Edmonton, but still, like they're usually on a short list of contenders when we get to the trade deadline and into the playoffs. And so, he's going to be in a spot where, as long as that continues, I think he can change some of maybe his own personal narrative. And I'm old enough to remember, Phil Kessel leaving Toronto, winning 2 Stanley Cups. Nazem Kadri leaving Toronto, winning a Stanley Cup. Tyler Bozak leaving, winning Stanley Cup. You can go down the list. It's longer than that, but that's just in recent memory. A lot of players have found more success somewhere else. And I do think Marner is the one guy that he had to wear this 24/7. Do you know what I mean? He lived in the GTA, the Toronto area, and even up north in cottage country in the summer is kind of like an extension of Toronto in a sense. There's so many people from the city in that area. There's exactly, you got some trees and woods and lakes around you, but there's not all that much privacy. He was doing this 24/7 really since 2015 when he was drafted. And so, I think that it didn't necessarily, by the end, honestly, I just don't know if he was enjoying it anymore. I think that's fair to say. Like, it was a full on life. And I don't mean the playing hockey part. I actually think for Mitch, that's always been the easy part. That's what he loves most. That's where you can see the joy that he has when he's on the ice. But I think a lot of the stuff that was happening behind the scenes and away from the arena, for him, for his family, it just got to be a lot. And, he got this golden opportunity to go join the Golden Knights. And obviously he took it, and he's going to be paid as of right now. He's tied with Mikko Rantanen. With the richest contract for a winger right now in the league, one of the richest in the league at $12 million. Don't want to go down the tax road again, but it's so topical this time of year. He's not paying as many taxes there in the state of Nevada, and he's going to have a chance to compete for the Stanley Cup. So what else could you ask for if you're a player, really? I mean, yes, he wanted it to happen in his hometown, but I'm trying really hard not to focus on the past, but I wrote the column about 3 years in a row when the Leafs got beat out. Like, this is the time to make a change. And there was always a sense to me that Marner was the one that probably made the most sense and probably would have been open to it on some degree, certainly in the last 2 years, had something worked out. And, they resisted doing that. They kept doubling down. And, I think that was a failing, right? That contributed to where they are today. Quite honestly, it was the wrong mix. Doesn't mean the individual players won't have success, even in Toronto somewhere, but they had the wrong mix. They had for way too long. They had too much tied up in too few players, which is not the players' fault because they earned those deals, but it was just not enough to spend somewhere else. Anyway, that's not the problem now. Now the problem that we're about to talk about is how do they replace Mitch Marner without actually being able to get another player with Mitch Marner's skill.
And having under $5 million in cap space per Puckpedia. How do the Leafs do that?
Well, look, I don't know who the player is. The Leafs have a lot more than $5 million in cap space because I think they have players on their roster right now that can be moved. They have someone like Ryan Reeves, who I would expect to be waived and sent to the AHL, which he was at the end of last season. They have a lot of ways to open up cap space that makes it. I mean, I'm not saying it's oodles, but they can get to 7 or 9 million, I think, pretty comfortably without even getting rid of anyone that right now you're thinking is going to play on opening night. They can also do some bigger things. I mean, if they consider trading one of their defensemen, some of those guys have even bigger cap hits attached to them. Now, those would probably be more what we might call hockey type of deals. If you're removing someone who's a useful player on your team, and you'd be getting something back in kind. So, I think the Leafs have lots of ways. The cap space won't be the challenge. The challenge is who is a player or players that they identify and what do they trade to get them? Because, the Leafs have a prospect in Easton Cowan But they've traded away, a bunch of first rounders in the coming years. They don't have the kind of capital that we're seeing in other trades, right? Whether it's Carolina giving up a first and a top prospect in Scott Morrow to get K'Andre Miller's rights. Look around the league. It's a lot of high draft pick capital that's getting deals done at this stage in the game. So, that's the challenge that Brad Treliving enters the summer with. He's got 2+ months to answer that question. And I'm sure what he would say too is that he's got even longer than that, because as long as the Leafs are good enough to compete for a playoff spot with what they have, you've got several more months once the season begins to make additions by the trade deadline. So, I think it's going to be a process that demands patience from Leafs fans. And I know they're notoriously not strong in that regard, but that's really where it is. I mean, they made a nice deal for Matias Vaselli from Utah. He's a player, Shane Doan is the right-hand man of Brad Treliving, and, has a lot of firsthand experience with Vaselli, obviously living down in Arizona, seeing his early days with the Coyotes. His son Josh, was just traded, actually, the J.J. Peterka deal, but played with Matias with Arizona and also with Utah last season. The Leafs think very highly and believe he's due for a big bounce back after a tough year last year. So they feel that they've added one guy that I think can play in the top six, but they're going to have to go get another one. And they've got time and they've got cap space. Now they have to lock in on some targets and find a way to make that kind of trade happen.
This next question could transition into a much broader discussion about these two players and so many other guys who could be available for trade or for UFA. But I'm curious how much interest the Leafs showed in two guys who I think a lot of teams would love on their top six, and Brock Boeser, who surprised me by staying in Vancouver, and Nick Ehlers, who as of now is the most coveted free agent available on the market.
Well, Brock Boeser was the biggest surprise of July 1st, hands down. I mean, he thought he was hitting the market. The Canucks thought he was hitting the market. Our big board had him in the top couple picks at that point. Like, everybody thought he was going there, but, he didn't feel totally sure about himself. And the Canucks basically threw out a Hail Mary about an hour from the free agent period officially opening, reached back out to his agent, and that got talks going. And they obviously came with a bigger offer than what they put on the table. Made him feel important, right? They got that offer to $50 million over 7 years, give or take a few bucks. And, during the season when they had some earlier talks, they were at somewhere around $40 million on the total deal. They got to a 6th and 7th year. Obviously, you got the kind of trade protection that made him feel good. I mean, that was the biggest surprise of that day for sure. Just because all indications were he were going to market. He was definitely going to have a huge crowd of teams, I think 10 or 11 teams, and that's what happened. And then the other guy is Nikolai Ehlers, and there's no point in us right now going too deep on his situation because I'm under the impression he is not very far from making his own decision, probably will have been made by the time the pod comes out. But, I've thought all along that he was a great fit for the Carolina Hurricanes. I believe they are one of the teams that are in on him here right till the end, and wouldn't be surprised at all to see him end up in Carolina. Washington Capitals had some interest there. I know the Colorado Avalanche were knocking on the door. Someone whispered the Tampa Bay Lightning were kind of lurking in the weeds. That's not confirmed. And honestly, I don't know how they do it from a cap perspective, but if anyone could find a way, it might be Julian Brisebois. But Ehlers, ultimately, what's interesting to me about his situation, he ended up being the top name as a result. I mean, he probably was anyway with Boeser, but Boeser goes off the board before noon Eastern time on free agency day. Obviously, we saw the Panthers guys, Marchand go, Bennett was gone, John Tavares had re-signed, the Marner sign and trade to Vegas had happened. And when the dust settled, you had Nikolai Ehlers there able to, I think, take his time, right? And he was back home in Denmark, able to sort of work through the scenarios, have some conversations with coaches and people in the organizations of the teams that were showing interest in him, and, making a more informed decision, I think, than frankly a lot of players get to make. I mean, some players, it's a really quick call. I mean, even Brock Boeser, he went to his gym the morning of July 1st. He said he didn't get any workout done because he was just so distracted with his phone and on calls and everything. But he himself didn't expect Vancouver to be there. Now, obviously, if you're going to make a quick call, as long as the money and the contract get where you like, it's easiest to stay where you are. The city, but sometimes players are making rather hurried decisions on a day like July 1st. where they haven't necessarily considered everything. I mean, obviously they do prep with their agents and they think about landing spots and all those types of things. But, I've talked to a lot of guys after the fact. Like that is a very stressful day. Even as much as there are some conversations and there's an idea that it could be this place or this place or this place, usually those decisions are made pretty quick. Look at all the guys that signed on July 1st. And then, even this morning, July 2nd, there's, another big wave. Like there's not much left on the board. And Nikolai Ehlers, as I mentioned, will probably be off it by the time you're hearing this podcast, which is why I'm not going to delve into all the possibilities and maybes, and maybe we'll tidy him up next week once we know exactly where he went.
Yeah, we can definitely do that. What about some pieces? I mean, hopefully these don't get dated either, but what about some other pieces that might still be available, maybe more on the trade side of things, right? Like we know the free agent board is thinning out, but I'm very curious about some pieces that could have been available for trade. Keandre Miller, we kind of mentioned him a couple of moments ago, going from the New York Rangers to the Carolina Hurricanes. I'm curious about your thoughts on that, but Bowen Byram still out there. Rasmus Anderson still out there. Vladislav Gavrikov signing also with the New York Rangers. I got to mention him too. But if you're a team that's looking for a defenseman, are you looking more towards trades or are you looking more towards free agency now?
Well, look, it's a bit of both. There's a lot of moving pieces and they're all tied together, right? Vegas was in on Rasmus Anderson. It didn't happen. And so, Calgary has been in on Bowen Byram. It didn't happen. I think that if you're trading a piece out, especially, you have to be confident you're getting one back in. I mean, that was a key part of what the Rangers did with their Keandre Miller deal. They signed Vladislav Gavrikov as a free agent. Before that, they actually let Zach Jones go, didn't qualify him. He signed in Buffalo. So they're changing up a blue line, which I think makes sense defensively. And this isn't all just on the defenseman, but defensively, the Rangers were a pretty porous team last year. And so, they then are more comfortable making the Keandre Miller deal, knowing that they have Gavrikov locked up. They love how much of a defensive stopper he can be. And, in Miller, they get a first round pick, a second round pick, and Scott Morrow, which is, that's a lot of capital for a team that intends to be a playoff team next year. I think, in an ideal world, they're hoping that those picks could be something they could trade, right? That could be something, ammunition they're using for an upgrade. Frankly, that's where Carolina was in that position because they had excess picks because of the Mikko Rantanen deal they made, right? And so it's just interesting when you become a good team. Like I was mentioning, the problem with the Leafs is just not having the things to trade necessarily, or it being more complicated for them to make a deal. Some of those teams are well armed for that, and that's why those trades happen. And so I do think that there'll be an ability to circle back here. The Byram situation in particular is kind of interesting because, there are certainly whispers out there, strong whispers, I'd say, of an offer sheet for Bowen Byram. As of this moment, he hasn't signed one, but he's 2 years from being a UFA. He could sign the kind of contract that, maybe the Sabres wouldn't necessarily want to match for him. And what does Kevin Adams say on the morning of July 2nd? We're matching any offer sheet. So there's definitely a give and take out there. The Sabres are willing to move Byram. That's not the issue. They don't want to move him for futures. And if you get an offer sheet and you let the player walk, what do you get? You get draft picks. In the case of Byram, it's probably a first and a third, or a first, a second, and third. That's basically somewhere on that $7 million mark is where he's likely to land if he ends up signing an offer sheet. So that would be what they would get in return if they didn't match. By matching, at least they have the player. You can't trade him for 12 months, but maybe you can look at trading him next offseason. I still think they're willing to trade him now, but they have to get something back that works. And so, it's going to be a summer, I do believe, where we see more trades than we have in the past on this side of July 1st. I think there's going to be more league business done. Too many teams came away, and this was expected, but came away not filling enough of their needs or their desires on free agency. And so, definitely that trade market is going to stay open. I'm fascinated to see how Byram turns out. I mean, Anderson will be interesting too, but the fact that the Flames have kind of set everyone's expectations up that they could bring him into next season, that they've done it before with other players, potentially move him at the deadline next year. That one doesn't feel like it has to happen. Whereas, clearly with Bowen Byram, there has to be some kind of decision. He's a restricted free agent. He doesn't have a contract. And the question of how he gets that contract, what it looks like, and who it's with is still to be answered here in the weeks ahead.
Of I want to look back at some of the work that was done through what teams did yesterday on the market, and even some of what's happened today. Was there a team in terms of how they spent that made you think, they did some good spending, and some other team that made you kind of shake your head a little bit? There's a couple teams that come to mind for that second one, but I'm very curious about
what's in your mind. I mean, honestly, I don't look at the big picture in the moment. Like, I'm so focused on the deals, and like I can never see the whole horizon in real time.
So like, I would love to know what you thought about what Boston did. Like, I still think the Victor Arvidsson trade they did was not that bad. They took advantage of a situation where Edmonton wanted to flip off an asset and clear some salary cap space. But that deal for Tanner Jeannot with that term and money, it's a lot of money for a guy who should be a fourth line player. It's just very puzzling to see what the Boston Bruins did on that front. That's at least what I think, and I think there are other people who feel that way as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, Boston is trying to rebuild a little bit on the fly. And, Tanner Jeannot had options. I mean, a lot of good teams. I think the Leafs were a team that liked Tanner Jeannot. There was a lot of teams out there that liked what he could bring. Now, they weren't getting to those kind of, to win out in those kind of bidding situations. I do think sometimes you have to go, you have to go a little farther than maybe even you're comfortable with, right? That's the price of doing business. And that's ultimately where Boston landed. I mean, they're trying to get players that are ready to play that are in their 20s, right? Like the first act of this is they turned over a team. They turned over a lot of 30-year-olds, Charlie Coyle, Brad Marchand, Brandon Carlo, the deals they made at the deadline. And I will say that, I don't expect them to return to playoff consideration like that. That doesn't seem to be the case. But, this is an organization looking for pieces and looking to restore an identity. And one thing Don Sweeney has been consistent about, he's not in for a long rebuild here. Like, he's not, if it was just his desire to trade away pieces and go to the bottom of the league, he could have done that. But he's trying to basically catch another wind. And we've seen some teams do it. I don't come away from July 1st saying, hey, the Bruins are on that path 100%, but let's see what else happens before the puck drops next season. And the truth is, the teams that we call winners on July 1st, the ones who get all the players, often become the losers, right? I mean, we all only have to remember Nashville as an example from last year with all the money they spent on July 1st, 2024, and how that worked out in this season where they ended up missing the playoffs. And by a large margin. But, it's a hard day, especially in a cap league, to, you need players. You're trying to get better. Like, you need actual humans to fill out your roster to win games. You got all this cap space. What are you going to spend it on? Well, sometimes you spend too much. And I think, I didn't actually see as much crazy spending as I was expecting. I will say that. It's probably partly due to the fact that, as I mentioned, that almost all the top players entering free agent period stayed where they were. So they didn't use their leverage in this environment, right? Like, you didn't have Sam Bennett coming off a Conn Smythe trophy, go to the market and be like, okay, market, who's willing to go craziest for me? I mean, even Brad Marchand, like I mentioned, he got a 6-year deal. No one that I know of saw that coming. But the fact is that he, if he had gone to market coming off his season, maybe he would have got that $9 million, number that I was tossed around out there. Someone had even told me 10 the last day before he signed. So I don't know where that was all cut. But the point is, it's like, we didn't see players use the leverage that was built in for them enough. So we didn't actually see, like, look, there's a few contracts. I get it. Like, you look at the LA Kings and, I think there's a lot of questions, Cody Cece's deal, $4.5 million. They brought in Corey Perry, gave him a raise at age 40 with when you factor in the bonuses that he can earn with the Kings. Brian Dumoulin, they re-signed Kuzmenko, signed Yoel Armia. I mean, that was a busy day for Ken Holland. Obviously, he's hoping that team can win. Like, you don't make those moves. You expect those players to become contributors on a good team right out of the box. And, that that remains to be seen. But yeah, look at it. It's probably a day. The teams that did the least on July 1st this year might end up feeling the best. It's not, and look, some good players were signed. Don't get me wrong, but it just didn't feel like the year to go too crazy. And frankly, I didn't see too many teams go too crazy. I mean, even the Jeannot deal. I guess what would he have to do for us to feel like he's lived up to that number? I mean, we're going to see the cap rise. I think maybe a little bit more offense than we've seen the last couple seasons would be a start. But we know what kind of player he is. The one year that he had all those goals in Nashville, that's the outlier season, right? That shouldn't be the baseline of expectation, but I still think he can make the team be harder to play against. And, the Bruins, I'm sure, concluded they got to spend their money on something. If they come away with no players, next year is going to be even worse than last season was.
One more quick question before we get to stick taps. One player whose name was in a bunch of rumors and is in an interesting situation now with trade protection and no move clause kicking in is Jordan Kyrou. At this point, with his trade protection getting kicked in, do you see him getting moved?
I can't say. I mean, it seems like that ship has sailed a little bit. And look, Montreal was a team that was trying to make that happen, right? And we saw those two teams, the Blues and the Canadiens, hook up for a pretty interesting trade with the Logan Mailloux deal for Zach Bolduc, straight up. Two guys that were in the same draft class, both first rounders that year, separated by 14, 15 picks, whatever it was. Bolduc, a forward, who's coming off a great season in St. Louis, especially down the stretch. He was a big part of the success they had in getting into the playoffs. Big guy, French Canadian. I'm sure those are all bonuses for the Canadians. And with Mailloux, his path to their full-time NHL roster was blocked ultimately by Reinbacher and Gooley and Hudson and all the nice young players they have. Plus now they've signed Noah Dobson to the deal he had. So, it's sort of like two organized. That was the most interesting trade we've seen in the last little while, I would say, just because two organizations solving their own needs straight up with picks. And obviously there's a little bit of risk involved because neither of those players are fully developed. And it's hard to say with certainty who's going to have the better career. I mean, I saw a lot of people saying the Habs absolutely won that deal, and that might be the case because Bolduc has certainly done more at the NHL level at this point. But if Logan Mailloux becomes a longtime NHLer, right shot defenseman, puts up a little bit of offense, meets his potential or exceeds it, I mean, maybe we'll look back in years and say, oh, wow, the Blues got what a savvy deal. I love the spirit of that trade just because of the shared risk in it. And so I know I'm off topic from your Kyrou question, but I think it's fair to assume the discussions they had around Kyrou got them to the point where they at least made that trade. And so I don't have any reason to believe the door's open on that. And I don't even know for sure how real Kyrou's availability ever was, right? I mean, the way the Blues operate, we saw Doug Armstrong talk about Braden Shen with other teams at the deadline, then ultimately not trade him. So it's a hard thing to know exactly. I mean, certainly there was conversations on Kyrou, that much I can say with certainty, but how real they were, how willing the Blues were going to be to move him, that part I don't know.
Okay. The no trade clause sticks with Jordan Kyrou. And with that, it's time for stick taps. And there's really only one person who's deserving of stick taps, I think, for us this week. And it's someone who means so much to the profession of sports media, particularly in Canada. If you are a fan of hockey and you grew up watching TSN, you have watched Bob McKenzie, the ultimate hockey insider, do his thing. He had been at TSN for 25 years. He had been working for 48 years. And a big reason why people like Chris Johnston, Pierre LeBrun, Darren Dreger, Elliot Friedman have the jobs and prominence they have today is because of what Bob McKenzie has been able to do in the field, not just working as a hockey insider and working as a hockey journalist and doing his thing on print platforms, but paving that way to go over to TV as well. I think Bob McKenzie and I think you feel this way too, a giant in our industry. And I am happy that he gets to enjoy retirement after all of these years of hard work and great relationships with his colleagues and breaking all of these crazy stories. It was really great to see you all at TSN give him his flowers and pay tribute to him at the end of your free agent frenzy coverage. Yeah,
it was a really cool day. And like what's nice for Bob is he's going out on his own terms completely. fully, completely, as he said, big tragically hip fan. But, he could have had some degree of semi-retirement, been still working a little bit, but decided, he really wants to devote the next chapter to his family. And, let's face it, most of us in sports media know it's not going to end well for us at some point. Most of us, we've seen many great, excellent colleagues, have those decisions made for them by companies or situations they're in. So it's neat to see someone actually retire on their own terms. It's almost like seeing someone go out on top as an athlete, like win the championship and then, have their family on the ice or the field and celebrating that moment and then saying, this has been an awesome journey and I'm going to end it right here. That was kind of the equivalent for it. And so, Bob obviously paved the way. I think as I've thought about it a little bit today, what's unique about the career is he made the role that like he was the first insider in hockey. He was, to my knowledge, the first that kind of jumped over as a print reporter that ended up having a really significant TV presence. And, he became the best at it in a way because it was suited to him. But like, if you make the job that you're the only one who can do at the level you can do it, I mean, everybody else is sort of a copy and usually the reasonable facsimiles aren't as good as the original. Right. So, I mean, he really was, he had a unique career and so many of us do. I know personally, I feel that I'm indebted to him in this crazy roundabout way. It's not that he was doing anything for me, but he paved the way for me to have the kind of life I've had and to have the kind of time in hockey. And honestly, as I wrote in my athletic tribute, I've shared meals with Bob. I've shared laughs with Bob. I got to share a little time with him on the insider desk here the last few years at TSN. And, I think more than the scoops, and there was obviously such a ridiculous amount of those, it's not even worth recounting. But more than the scoops, what will be remembered is how he went about his business, how he treated people in his industry and that he worked with, and the way he did the job. I think that's what set him apart. His integrity, the values he operated with, and what a tremendous career. So he's a legend and he's going out on top. So that's the best you can say it.
Absolutely. All the best to you, Bob McKenzie. He is more than deserving of a stick tap from us here on the CJ show. I mean, look at some of the gifts he got on TSN, and a nice silver stick. That was amazing. Great on TSN, of course, for their tribute.
Did you know that
Bob.
was made by the same people that make the silver sticks given to NHL players when they reach the 1,000-game milestone? So
I wondered about that. It was
made by the same. I don't know the company, or I'd shout them out here, and I believe it was 22 pounds. I actually got to lift it. It was heavy enough. It was when you knew when you were lifting it. Not quite the Stanley Cup weight, but which I haven't lifted, to be clear, but still pretty significant. And what a gift the TSN gave Bob on the way out.
Absolutely. Deserving for a titan in our industry. That's going to do it for today's edition of the CJ Show. CJ, great work as always. We'll let you get back to your phone and with all the news breaking as it happens.
I'm ready for summer, buddy.
The Chris Johnston Show. Follow Chris on Twitter @ReporterChris and follow Julian @JKA McKenzie.
The Chris Johnston Show.